The history of MMA is a bottomless well of interesting characters and strange events. However, in the modern sanitized promotion that we know as the UFC, there isn't a lot of room for the weirdness of old. Perhaps the homogenization of the promotion is why fighters like Henry Cejudo and Tony Ferguson have garnered a following. But there is a fighter still fighting for the UFC who has been weird before El Cucuy kicked his first pipe. For most people, the first encounter they had with Diego was through The Ultimate Fighter Season 1. There isn't much I can say about TUF 1 that hasn't already been said. It was one of the most crucial moments in UFC history, and the brawl between Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar that took place on the TUF finale is widely regarded to be the reason for the growth and popularity of the UFC and MMA as a whole in the United States. In the early 2000s, The Ultimate Fighter was about the closest thing to stardom that American MMA had to offer. Diego's quirky personality quickly made him one of the standout characters on the show. In fact, many of the most memorable moments from TUF 1 were related to Diego's antics, such as punching the air because he was drunk and thought that aliens were invading, or getting into an argument with Stephan Bonnar about using all of the asparagus tops in his shake. It wasn't all alcohol and asparagus for Diego, though. He was a legitimately good fighter who used a mixture of wrestling, ground and pound, and submissions to rack up 3 victories on the show. 2 came by way of rear naked choke finishes early in the first round, and the third was a close decision win over Josh Koscheck in a fight that saw Koscheck predominantly circle and shoot for takedowns, while Diego staged most of his offense by hunting for submissions off his back. These wins earned Diego a spot on the TUF finale against Kenny Florian to decide who would become the show's 185-pound winner. This fight, however, was not especially competitive. Less than 2 minutes into the fight, Diego was able to mount Florian and deliver a barrage of strikes that forced the referee to step in. After the win over Florian, Diego dropped down to 170 pounds and went on a tear through the welterweight division, which included a few forgotten gems of MMA like his barn burner against Nick Diaz. Typically, the way you beat Nick Diaz is to kick him in the legs or stifle him with a controlling top game. He's the kind of guy who catches you in a meme choke even though he's higher than giraffe pussy, to quote Professor of Primatology Joseph Rogan. The point is, you don't want to play around in Nick's guard. You want to take a conservative approach. But Diego spent the majority of the fight sitting in Nick's guard and spamming wild punches at his head until he got the W. Diego's fight with Karo Parisyan was no less exciting. Parisyan is a name that has all but faded from the MMA lexicon these days, but there was a time when his name was spoken alongside welterweight legends like George St. Pierre and Matt Hughes. From the very beginning, the fight between Sanchez and Parisyan was bonkers. In less than 30 seconds, Diego took Parisyan down, mounted him, and then took his back. I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that this is one of the most entertaining fights in Diego's career. It was a back-and-forth battle where both guys put on a show with wrestling, striking, jiu-jitsu, and high-impact judo throws that you rarely see in MMA. But at the end of the night, Diego had his hands raised. To close out 2006, Sanchez absolutely demolished Joe Diesel Riggs with a punch, a knee, and several follow-up shots that put Riggs out cold. However, this is where Diego's undefeated streak came to an end. At UFC 69, Diego was opposite Josh Koscheck, who had also dropped down to welterweight after his fight on The Ultimate Fighter and amassed a record of 6 wins and 1 loss over the last 2 years. The unofficial rematch between Sanchez and Koscheck was in some ways similar to their fight on TUF, but in other ways very different. Neither fighter had improved their striking dramatically, but Josh had improved the most of the two. Koscheck also avoided taking Diego down himself, where Sanchez might have been able to submit him or initiate a scramble, as he did frequently during their TUF fight. This resulted in a lot of circling, and Koscheck keeping Diego at range with a jab, on the way to an uneventful unanimous decision victory that saw the audience booing on multiple occasions. There was an additional wrinkle to the story that came out when Dana White revealed that prior to the fight, Diego had been suffering from a mysterious illness that the UFC doctors thought was hepatitis C. It actually just turned out to be good old staph infection, which apparently left Diego with a hole in his leg the size of a coffee cup. That would probably explain his less than stellar performance, but nevertheless, Diego decided he needed to make some changes in his career. One of those changes included parting ways with his longtime coach, Greg Jackson. According to Diego, the move was also at least in part due to the fact that Greg Jackson had recently brought welterweight champion George St. Pierre into the fold at Jackson's MMA. Either way, Diego made the move to San Diego, California, where he began training under Rob Garcia and the legendary Ribeiro brothers. It would take some time to adjust, and unfortunately for Diego, his next fight was against John Fitch, Aside from his career reviewing documentaries, Fitch is probably best known for his stifling wrestling, which led to a several-year-long stretch where he was considered the consensus second-best welterweight in the world. Sanchez had more success taking Fitch down than he had with Koscheck, but every time he managed to get John on the ground, Fitch would reverse him and start Operation Wet Blanket again. There were a few moments where Diego was briefly able to lock up a submission, but Fitch escaped every time, only to resume the one-sided smothering. In less than 4 months, Diego had gone from being undefeated in 17 fights to riding a 2-fight losing streak. When he faced off against David Bilgedin at UFC 82, it seemed like a return to form for the Nightmare. In less than a round, Diego was able to mount Bilgedin and force him to tap to strikes. It was a solid win, but by now we already knew that Diego was a good wrestler with merciless ground and pound. His striking was the hole in his skill set that he would need to improve if he wanted to climb the welterweight rankings again. And improve he did. In his fight with Luigi Fioravanti, Diego almost looked like a different fighter. His striking had improved by leaps and bounds over a period of a couple months, and he dropped Fioravanti on several occasions, including an impressive head kick. This was crucial because Fioravanti was able to all but neutralize Diego's wrestling. By developing his striking game, Diego now had a plan B to fall back on in the event that his wrestling failed. Improving his striking was not the only change Diego was making though. After beating Fioravanti, Sanchez dropped down to lightweight, which was apparently facilitated in part by working with legit crazy person Dan Quinn. Quinn is too much to get into here, but he's most well known for advocating the health benefits of stevia, which he believes turns water into pure H2O and may have resurrected his dead cat. After seeing some of Quinn's stevia testimonials, Diego began using the sweetener himself, and even introduced his girlfriend to it as well.
Oh, my girl, she had a little lump on her breast, and she had it for over a year and a half, and it slowly started getting bigger and bigger, and we had to go to the doctor. We're a little worried about it. Well, coincidentally, we started taking stevia. I started taking stevia. My girlfriend followed my lead, started taking stevia with me. Within 2 weeks, with a lot of prayer and taking the stevia, it disappeared, and it was completely disappeared. Something that was there for over a year and a half. So, you know, I don't have a doctor explanation for it. I think of it as a miracle.
We may never know how much stevia helped Diego, but he was able to make the cut down to 155 pounds nonetheless. In his lightweight debut, Diego faced former title challenger and fellow Tough alumni, Joe Daddy Stevenson. It was another impressive win where Diego's striking looked even more improved than it had against Luigi. That being said, the fight is probably remembered more for Diego's bizarre walkout than his in-cage performance. As impressive as Diego looked in his previous 3 fights, he turned things up several notches in his Hall of Fame brawl with Clay Guida. Within the opening seconds, Diego had dropped Guida, knocked his mouthpiece out, and split his nose open, and at no point did Guida back down. He didn't even slow down when Diego opened up another cut on the top of Guida's Precambrian noggin, which proceeded to pump more salty crimson fluid all over both of them. It's really hard to call either participant of a fight this good a loser, but in terms of scoring criteria, Diego was the winner by a large margin. It seemed as though Diego Sanchez was peaking as a fighter. In another timeline, he might have become the lightweight champion. The problem was, Diego was fighting in the same timeline as BJ Penn, arguably the greatest lightweight of all time, and during his prime, possibly the most talented fighter to ever compete in mixed martial arts. At this time, Penn hadn't lost a fight in 7 years to anyone not named St. Pierre, Hughes, or Machida. Those first 2 you'll recognize as the 2 greatest welterweights of all time, and the third is a man who would eventually win the UFC light heavyweight title a few years after beating Penn in an open weight fight. Even worse for Diego was that the version of BJ Penn he was up against wasn't the demotivated, drunken, street-brawling Penn that we're familiar with today. This was the Velociprodigy stage of BJ's career, when he was handing out crimson masks and practicing light cannibalism. Diego was well and truly fucked. Not that any of this mattered to him, though. Diego was mentally incapable of understanding his own limitations. If you tell him he can't beat another fighter, Diego will just assume he needs to do more thunderstorm yoga to charge up his yes cartwheel. This kind of mental fortitude has been a great asset for Diego throughout his career, but the last thing you want to bring to a fight with BJ Penn, other than a free drink voucher for the Lava Shack, is delusional self-belief. Penn is a violent sociopath whose only concern is turning you into a human Capri Sun pouch with his bare hands. Which is exactly what he did in this fight. From the opening bell, he mauled Sanchez, dropping the challenger 4 times in a matter of seconds. This is an amount of brain damage that a neurologist would refer to as a shitload. Thanks to some very generous refereeing, Diego was able to survive the onslaught and attempted to take BJ down. But trying to take BJ Penn down is only marginally less dangerous than trying to strike with him. He's possessed by an ancient Hawaiian breakdancing god that lets BJ jump out of pools and defend takedowns by levitating. I'm not saying this is the most one-sided title fight in UFC history, but it had more in common with a mountain lion attack than sanctioned hand-to-hand combat. The fight consisted entirely of BJ hitting Diego with strikes that would kill any non-Mexican, and Diego responding by punching air and bleeding. Just to put things into perspective, Diego landed 8 total strikes over the course of 5 rounds, and BJ landed 149. Penn also stuffed all 27 of Diego's takedown attempts. It almost feels academic to describe what happened round by round, because it's just 4.5 rounds of utter domination by BJ. And when I said 4.5 rounds, I hope I didn't just give you false hope for a Sanchez comeback in the 5th, because all that happened was BJ kicked Diego in the head hard enough to open up a cut that made the mass transit incident look like a minor nosebleed. I'm sure this was the point where Diego thought he had Penn exactly where he wanted him. But unless your name is Sakuraba, mid-fight facial reconstructive surgery is usually a reason for a doctor to get involved. I can't show you the uncensored picture of the cut, or the video will probably get age restricted, but it is without a doubt one of the worst in MMA history, and the fight was declared a TKO. The loss to BJ Penn would prove to be the beginning of a very dark time in Diego's life. In Diego's own words, it was the first time he had ever been beat up in a fight. For someone with such unshakable mental fortitude, it must have been a difficult blow to handle, and Diego's method of coping with self-doubt was by abusing alcohol and marijuana. The problem was evident during his appearance at the World MMA Awards, where he was being honored with Fight of the Year for his 3-round war with Clay Guida. During his acceptance speech, Diego was clearly inebriated and had trouble putting a coherent sentence together.
Next year, I'm gonna be coming more words, more years, more words. Damn, I love you guys,
Sadly, Diego's personal struggles were much worse behind the scenes. His newfound fame and financial success had sent him down a path of partying that attracted negative influences into his life, a problem that Diego was too intoxicated to comprehend at the time. In a tale as old as the fight game itself, Diego entrusted his finances to somebody he believed to be a friend, who proceeded to embezzle $170,000 of Diego's money. By February of 2010, Diego was broke, had hit rock bottom, and was $250,000 in debt with the IRS. This only drove Diego further into depression and substance abuse. Diego was in no shape to fight at the time, and especially not at 155 pounds. But he needed the money, so he went back up to 170 and faced off against the undefeated John the Hitman Hathaway. This was not the kind of performance you would hope to see from a fighter trying to right their career after a devastating loss. In the first round, Diego was floored by a massive knee from Hathaway, who spent the rest of the round dominating Diego with heavy ground and pound. The following rounds weren't as bad for Diego, but he was still unable to secure a takedown or close the distance against Hathaway's range and superior striking. Once again, Diego found himself riding a 2-fight losing streak. Only this time, both losses were one-sided defeats. By his own account, he needed to do some soul-searching. Quote, "I was sucked into a life of sin. I was smoking weed, I was drinking, partying, and it just really truly held me back from my potential." End quote. Diego left his self-described life of sin in San Diego behind him, and moved back to Albuquerque, where he set about redevoting his life to God. Diego also returned to his roots at Jackson's MMA, where he was welcomed back with open arms. After returning to his hometown, Diego reunited with his high school girlfriend, Bernadette, and a few months later the two were married. However, what should have been a happy moment was marred by another personal tragedy. During his time in California, Diego had been deceived by a woman into believing he was the father of her child, and raised the boy as if he was his own. But upon his return to New Mexico, and subsequent marriage to Bernadette, the mother of Diego's child refused to let him see the boy. This resulted in a custody battle where a paternity test eventually revealed that Diego was not the child's biological father. At this point, I don't think anyone would have blamed Diego for returning to the bottle, but he managed to stay on the path of righteousness. Rather poetically, after weathering his own personal nightmare, Diego decided to change his nickname to The Dream. the newly christened Sanchez was able to put together consecutive wins over Paulo Thiago and Martin Kampmann. The former was a vintage performance that saw Diego dominate the second and third rounds with takedowns and overwhelming ground and pound. The Kampmann fight, however, was a bit controversial. The fight was non-stop action, with both fighters going full rock'em sock'em robots on multiple occasions. On the other hand, Kampmann controlled most of the fight and landed the most significant strike of the night when he dropped Diego with a picture-perfect straight right. Also, the stats do not lie. Kampmann landed half again as many significant strikes as Diego. It seems like the judges simply saw Diego's aggression and wild exchanges and gave him the win. Either way, there was no controversial decision in Diego's next fight, when he came up against rising welterweight Jake Ellenberger. Ellenberger looks like a fire hydrant that made a wish to be a real boy on a shooting star, and he had just knocked Jake Shields out so hard that Shields tried to wrestle the referee. Diego's chances didn't look great on paper, and within the first round of the fight, Jake had already knocked him down with a punch. If you were to score this fight by who had the most impressive moment of the fight, you would have to give it to Diego though. A takedown by Ellenberger led to a scramble that ended with Diego spending the last 90 seconds of the fight on Jake's back, blasting him with unmitigated strikes. That being said, fights aren't scored that way, and Jake had comfortably won the other 13 plus minutes of the fight. As with the Joe Daddy Stevenson fight, this fight is probably better remembered for Diego's bizarre entrance, where he screamed and brandished a cross at something. Once again, Diego was looking to get back into the win column, and once again he decided to change weight classes. This time for a fight against Japanese MMA legend Takanori Gomi at UFC on Fuel 8. Unfortunately, this would be another controversial fight. To start, Diego missed weight by 3 pounds. The bigger issue is that, in the opinion of most people, Gomi appeared to win the fight. He landed more strikes, he landed the harder strikes of the fight, he stuffed almost all of Diego's takedowns, and he was the aggressor. Still, Diego walked away with the W. Which brings us to the fight with Gilbert Melendez. If you were to ask what the best 3-round fight in MMA was, it would be difficult not to put Diego Sanchez versus Gilbert Melendez close to the top. Like Sanchez versus Guida, it's one of those fights that if you watched it live, you'll never forget it. It should be said that part of the drama of this fight came from the circumstances under which it occurred. Melendez was 21-3 at the time, and his most recent fight was a close decision loss to then-champion Benson Henderson, in a fight that many believed Melendez had won. In the build-up to their fight, Diego even said he thought Gilbert was the real champion.
I believe this guy's the real true uncrowned champ that I'm fighting. And so going into the fight with Gilbert, I feel like I'm fighting a title fight that without the belt.
Diego, on the other hand, had missed weight in his last fight and arguably should have been on a 3-fight losing streak. We knew what Diego's flaws were as a fighter, and by October of 2013, it looked like he was past his prime. While it would be unfair to say that people thought this fight would be a blowout, the general consensus was that Gilbert would use his technical striking to pick apart Sanchez on the feet, which is what he did for a while. Something happened over the course of this fight. Make no mistake, Gilbert was getting the better of the exchanges, but the exchanges he was getting dragged into were becoming wilder and wilder. Then, with 2 minutes left in the third round, it happened. Diego Sanchez, leaking like a sieve, threw an uppercut that looked like it was blessed by Korn himself, and it almost knocked Gilbert off his feet and initiated a grappling exchange that saw Diego attempt multiple submissions that were cruelly thwarted by his own sweat and blood. Even when Gilbert managed to reverse position on Diego, they got back to their feet and finished the fight by swinging for the fences.
They're going to swing to the finish!
Oh my God!
Unbelievable!
Oh my God!
Whoa!
Was this a technical MMA fight? No. It was the kind of unbelievable war you only see once every few years if you're lucky. And yes, a lot of MMA snobs did point out after the fact that even in the wild exchanges, Gilbert got the better of Diego. But at the end of the day, it's pretty immaterial. That one moment where Diego landed that uppercut from hell and nearly upset Melendez is still one of the most memorable moments in MMA history, at least in my opinion. The fight with Gilbert Melendez is a high point in Diego's career, but also a turning point. His prospects as a title contender were essentially over, but he was still a competent fighter with a lot of name value. His fights weren't going to have major divisional implications, but you could put him up against a rising fighter or a fellow legend, and it would add a little spice to the entertainment stew of a card. It was a phase of Diego's career defined by a few broad patterns, alternating wins and losses, weight class changes, injuries, and repeated nickname changes. After the Melendez fight, he dropped a decision to Miles' jury, and then came out on the winning side of one of the worst judging decisions in MMA history against Ross Pearson. The decision was so bad that the UFC awarded Pearson his win bonus and stated that they would treat the fight as a victory for Pearson going forward. After the Pearson fight, Diego was out of action for a while due to a broken collarbone, but when he came back he rebranded himself as the Nightmare again and attempted an ill-conceived move down to featherweight, where he lost a decision to Ricardo Lamas. He did manage to pick up a legitimate victory in a fun scrap against Jim Miller, but the short win streak came to an end when Diego stepped into the cage against fellow bonus hunter Joe Lauzon. It would take Lauzon less than 90 seconds to beat Diego by TKO, marking the first time Diego had ever been finished by anything other than a doctor's stoppage. Again though, Diego managed to bounce back with a win over Marcin Held, but all that did was earn him a fight against Al Iaquinta. It was during this training camp that Diego suffered a strange heart scare, leading to another change in nickname. On the Friday of his first week of training for Iaquinta, Diego had already put in a wrestling practice and ran around a mountain, but still decided to put in some grappling with John Jones. The grappling session evolved to include kicks and even some body strikes. This was followed by sprints while everyone else was resting. Then even more grappling against multiple partners. During one of these grappling exchanges, Diego went for a flying armbar, and when landing on his back, felt a strange sensation in his heart. This prompted Diego to leave the gym and spend 20 minutes lying on the grass using yoga techniques to calm himself down. Instead of going to the hospital, Diego decided to return home, where he prayed and fasted for a week. While in this state of fasting and prayer, Diego felt he was communicating with the Holy Spirit, and that God told him his nickname should reflect what defined him as a fighter. What Diego believed defined him was his heart, and so Diego Lionheart Sanchez was born. Diego did eventually go to the hospital, where he was told that his heart was completely healthy. Still, he kept the new nickname. Sadly, the Lionheart moniker did not help him against Al Iaquinta, who brutally knocked Diego out in the first round. Diego didn't take much time off, though. Within 5 months, he had decided to return to the welterweight division in a fight against Matt the Immortal Brown. 3.5 minutes into the fight, Brown landed an elbow that folded Diego like a lawn chair. Diego Sanchez, who up to this point had gone 23 fights in the UFC, with only 1 KO by doctor stoppage, had now been knocked out in 3 of his last 4 fights. After this fight, Diego took a 10-month layoff. During that time, maybe somebody in the UFC realized that Diego could use a step down in competition because they matched him up against Craig White, a fighter who doesn't have a Wikipedia page and had been TKO'd in his UFC debut. Diego was able to get the fight to the ground consistently and dominated White for 3 rounds. This was followed up in March of 2019 when he faced off against Mickey Gall. Gall had actually called Diego out looking for an easy fight and talked some trash during the lead up to UFC 235, but his words would come back to bite him. Gall had some success on the feet, but Diego was able to drag the fight to the ground, where he wore Gall down with relentless grappling and ground and pound. Finally, late in the second round, Diego poured the punches onto an exhausted Gall until the referee was forced to stop the fight. It was the first time Diego Sanchez had been able to put together a 2-fight win streak in 8 years, and nearly 11 years since his last finish against Luigi Fioravanti back in June of 2008. But the glory of this moment was short-lived. Only a few months after the victory over Gall, Diego was matched up against Michael Chiesa. During the pre-fight media scrums for UFC 239, Diego had a lot of things to say.
I am a Jedi, and I am anti-aging, and I proclaim I'm coming for my destiny right now.
But perhaps the most unusual information he divulged was the fact that he had left his longtime home of Jackson's MMA ahead of the fight with Michael Chiesa.
I made a crucial decision. This is a Diego Sanchez moment. I made a crucial decision. It's 3 weeks before the fight. No more JW. JacksonWink, one of the best teams in the world. No, I'm going in with one trainer.
It was a surprising change for Diego, because he was one of the most vocal critics of Donald Cerrone when he left Jackson's in 2018. Cerrone infamously referred to Jackson's as a puppy mill, and was particularly unhappy with Mike Winkeljohn coaching his opponent Mike Perry for their fight at UFC Fight Night 139. Interestingly, Diego's reasons for leaving Jackson/Winkeljohn in 2019 line up pretty well with Cowboy's grievances. Sanchez felt that, as the fighter who opened the gate for Jackson into the UFC, he was not receiving the proper amount of attention he deserved.
I got back from Hawaii from helping BJ Penn get ready for his fight. I sent a text message to Greg and Wink saying, let me buy you dinner. Let's do a team meeting because I'm a professional athlete and we need to set a plan going forward because I know how much is at stake in this fight. My contract, my career, my life, so much is at stake. This is a culmination of 20 years of hard work coming into one night. I needed to do this. 3 months out, I set this text message. Let me buy you guys dinner. I didn't get a text back from either of them.
Now, it's not unusual for fighters to change training camps. As we discussed earlier, Diego had already left Jackson's once back in 2007 when they brought in George St. Pierre. Personally, I think leaving Jackson's was the right move for Diego at this stage in his career. While Jackson's has been considered a top-notch camp at times, there are a few problems associated with their training methods. First, there is the commonly held belief that fighters who move to this camp are transformed into boring point fighters. But I think the bigger issue is with long-term members of the camp who have stagnated in their development or have persistent holes in their skill set. Cowboy Cerrone consistently struggled against southpaws, boxers, and pressure fighters, even after years under the tutelage of Jackson and Winklejohn. Carlos Condit may have been able to employ a safe game plan against Nick Diaz, but in other fights he has shown serious flaws on the ground, as well as poor fight IQ and a tendency to take unnecessary amounts of punishment on the feet. And I don't even know where to begin with Leonard Garcia. Diego may be the best example of Jackson's stagnation. In the decades since his return to the camp, he seemed to regress in almost every aspect of his game. A change of camp was probably years overdue. But Diego's case was worrying because 3 weeks before the fight, he left an established camp to train with a single man, a self-awareness coach named Joshua Fabia. In the days leading up to UFC 239, we learned a few more details about Diego's new coach, courtesy of an interview with MMA Junkie. During the interview, Fabia spewed the expected metaphysical self-help nonsense about reviving ancient wisdom and teaching Diego to become aware of himself by becoming aware of everything around him. The most concerning revelation from the interview was the fact that Fabia wasn't just Diego's coach or manager. He was the wrestling coach, the striking coach, the nutritionist, the physical therapist, and much more. However, the full story wouldn't be revealed until after the fight. To say that Michael Chiesa dominated Diego Sanchez would be like saying that Jimmy Savile was a bad babysitter. The official scorecards were a unanimous 30-26, but it arguably should have been 30-24. Diego had a few fleeting moments of success, but the fight was largely characterized by Chiesa manhandling Diego on the ground and coming close to finishing him on several occasions. It was an unprecedented feat, because even in the waning years of his career, Diego's grappling always remained competitive. This was the first time he was ever completely outclassed on the ground. The most unusual moments of the fight came courtesy of Diego's only cornerman, Josh Fabia. Throughout the fight, Fabia could be heard giving Diego bizarre advice such as, "Tyson him," "Move Diego move," "Crack the coconut," and "I need that Tyson," or saying that he needed to go 100. After the fight, Fabia became somewhat of a meme, as people discovered his social media accounts and his bizarre methods of training. At the time, the response wasn't as concerned for Diego as it would later become. Diego has always been a weird guy. He was a follower of Tony Robbins, who walked on hot coals, and he did thunderstorm yoga on The Ultimate Fighter. Longtime fans of Diego were familiar with his antics, and this just seemed like the latest evolution of a unique belief system that made him such a recognizable character. Some people were concerned for Diego, but most people at the time were just content to make fun of his ridiculous coach, until the night it stopped being funny. That night would be February 15th of 2020 at UFC Fight Night Rio Rancho, where Diego Sanchez fought Michel Pereira in the co-main event of the card. This fight is truly one of the most bizarre performances in Diego's career. Diego probably could have taken this fight to the ground and worn Pereira out, but instead made the strange decision to spend most of the fight circling along the fence and making amateurish bull rushes. Late in the third round, though, Pereira landed an illegal knee, which opened up a cut on Diego's head. Diego was given time to recover and asked if he could continue, but ultimately decided he could not, and was awarded a win via disqualification. After the fight, both Diego and Fabia came under fire for their actions. Diego was accused of giving up, but defended his DQ victory by saying it was a smart veteran decision. Meanwhile, Fabia was being criticized for his vague and meaningless advice between rounds. In response to the backlash, Diego credited Fabia with the record low damage he had taken in his most recent fights, and called out the MMA media for bullying. The next day, whoever was operating Diego's Instagram account made a post calling out Daniel Cormier for biased commentary and praised Joshua Fabia for being able to transform the fighting style of a 38-year-old man. Included in the post was a 12-minute video attempting to show the defensive skills utilized by Diego in the Pereira fight. As this was unfolding, more concerning details about Joshua Fabia were coming to light. One particularly bizarre bit of information that came out of this media frenzy was that allegedly ahead of UFC 239, Joshua Fabia warned the Nevada State Athletic Commission that Diego had been training a special move that could potentially kill Michael Chiesa. According to anonymous sources that contacted MMA Junkie, the move was described as a technique that started as a standing guillotine choke, but then would see Sanchez rotate his shoulders so that his opponent's head was braced above his shoulder before slamming him down to the floor and breaking his foe's neck. Fabia also apparently said this was a technique he learned from paramilitary groups in South America. So, basically in 2 paragraphs, we have ridiculous din mock techniques that look like wrestling finishing moves, as well as a bizarre Frank Dukes-esque backstory about training with South American jungle fighters. But it gets weirder. From the same article, the anonymous sources state that Fabia had been burning incense in a shared locker room and swabbed the inside of Diego's nose with peppermint oil to open his airways. A considerably less funny and more disturbing account came from UFC welterweight Emil Meek, who said that during a training session, Fabia chased him and other fighters around a cage with a sharpened blade. By now, several internet sleuths had been investigating Fabia's long and winding backstory, which involves several social media accounts, many of which have since been deleted. If you would like to really delve into Fabia's background, BJ J. Scott made a pretty thorough video, which I will link in the description, alongside a few others. Personally, I don't want to talk about Fabia's bullshido career, partly because I think he's just your run-of-the-mill martial arts fraud, but also because I don't want to show you the version of the man that he portrays himself to be in his videos. I want to show you how this guy acts when he doesn't have the ability to put on the facade of a calm and serene guru. Luckily, this doofus went on a press tour of almost every major MMA media outlet after the Pereira fight. Ironically, the self-awareness expert doesn't have any, because he comes off really bad during these interviews.
How many fucking rolls do you do every day in training, warm-up, before ever getting started?
100 every day.
Might be interesting,
We're in the thousands.
Might be interesting, Joe Rogan talking that shit about me saying 100. 100? Maybe you should ask me what the fuck it means, asshole.
One of the first things you'll notice about these interviews, other than the fact that Diego seems like a battered spouse, is the fact that Fabia is outrageously combative. I understand wanting to call out your critics, but Fabia attacks the MMA media like Donald Trump going after the New York Times. Fabia's combativeness makes a great deal of sense when you see how unbelievably, comically arrogant this man is.
You guys just left the UFC, right?
We just left there. We just left Sean Shelby. And if you think I'm talking like this now, I talk to him like that too. Don't think that I'm over here acting. I ain't putting up with nobody's shit, and I don't care who you think you are, I'm gonna call you out.
He brags so much and tells so many lies that he gives Steven Seagal a run for his money.
You guys are really hot on the white and the black. You're talking to somebody that's a master of the gray. You don't even see what I'm doing.
There's almost too many quotes to choose from, but I think this one perfectly captures his titanic ego.
No, hold on. He's seen me walk around the Holy Land barefoot and not take a slip. Like, understand, a year. How many times have you tripped, fell, busted your ass, regular shit? Come mess with me in my world and see if
Bottom line is,
in spite of his braggadocious nature, Fabia was unwilling or unable to provide any proof of his credentials to be a trainer for a UFC fighter. Whenever he was asked about his background in martial arts, or just athletics in general, he would find a way to deflect the conversation with a series of vagaries and cliches that border on, "I got my credentials from the School of Hard Knocks." Literally the only example that he could provide of his background in athletics was that he was on the first kindergarten rugby team in Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm not making that up.
I've been traveling around the world since I was born.
I was on the first kindergarten rugby league in Christchurch, New Zealand. I've participated in martial arts my whole life through actual family tradition of understanding things. Like, quite a bit different than going to a place and giving them money.
Fabia's nebulous credentials were an obvious cover for the fact that he didn't understand anything about MMA. For instance, he claimed that if Daniel Cormier tried to take down Michel Pereira, he would have been knocked out.
Diego should easily be able to take this guy down. Easily. You know, the guy that has the most dangerous fucking flying knees in the game. And nobody wants poor Diego to end up like poor Askren. But, you know, Cormier's saying, get in on those legs. I dare you to come in on those legs, bro. I dare you.
Daniel Cormier, the two-division champ and silver medalist in wrestling, would get knocked out trying to take down a welterweight. Fabia's ignorance goes beyond this one example, though. Over the course of several interviews, he was asked dozens of times why he, as a single person, offers more than multiple coaches and cornermen. The one time he actually tried to explain his position, he showed how little he really knew about common practices in MMA.
The wrestling guy's looking at the wrestling. The boxing guy's looking at the boxing. This guy's... Well, where's the guy looking at all of it? So like a football coach that has the guys on the ground calling in the plays, notice there's a head coach up in the crow's nest seeing the whole thing.
This is such an astoundingly stupid statement that it's hard to comprehend. Does Fabia really not believe MMA camps have head coaches? Jackson's MMA, the camp that Diego left, had a head coach. His name is Greg fucking Jackson. Any MMA training camp worth a fart has somebody whose job is looking at the fighters as a whole and coming up with game plans for them. So far, we've just seen Fabia acting like a narcissist and a buffoon. But the situation becomes much darker when we look at the dynamic between Joshua and Diego. Fabia behaves like such a cliched, abusive husband that the Lifetime channel could sue him for copyright infringement. He treats Diego like a dog. When he isn't interrupting Diego to make himself the center of attention, he's literally ordering Diego to speak.
And so once I was able to notice and be aware of that.
And give him an example of a training day. Tell him what happens in the morning. Tell him about what happens at the end of it. Give him an example of what's happening in this 3-hour session.
The way he treats Diego at times is beyond disrespectful. It's downright disgusting.
But hold on, am I just saying that or am I proving it to you? See, that's the difference. Everybody thinks that I'm just saying it. No. I don't ask for your respect. I will earn it. So here's a man who's thinking that, oh, I know what I'm doing. My abilities are high. Oh, what are you talking about?
Exactly.
My guard's good. And then I slap the shit out of you 3 times and your face goes down and you're like, okay, I don't know how I got slapped 3 times. Maybe I don't have a good guard. Maybe what he's saying is absolutely true. Maybe my face is pointed at the ground. Maybe I am acting like an animal. And if I don't go into a rage to win, I don't win.
As shameful as Fabia's behavior is, he takes it a step further. Whenever he's disparaging Diego's abilities, he always makes sure to praise himself for helping Diego leave his old fighting style behind.
Forrest Griffin and all these guys are all helping him, all against just little old me, and nobody's saying, wow, it's kind of amazing that Diego survived that, didn't get tapped, broke loose 4, 5, 6 times, created scrambles, did this. But, you know, if I got to break down the video and show you what's really going on, I will.
When you look at manipulators, whether it be abusive spouses, cult leaders, or fake martial arts gurus, they all have the same protocol. They isolate you from the rest of the world, they prey on your fears and insecurities, and then they present themselves as your only savior. Diego met Joshua at a low point in his life. He had gone through a divorce after his wife asked him to retire from MMA, and then started cheating on him, according to Diego.
None of my friends can, relate or talk to me about it, because they never been through it. They never been through the situation. All the circumstances are different. There's just no relation. They're more just of, fuck her, that type of mentality.
He was also unhappy with the way he was being treated by Jacksons. At that moment, Fabia entered the picture as somebody that Diego could trust with the emotions that other people in his life didn't understand.
I'm feeling his vibe. I'm just all right, I need someone to talk to right now. I like those, the homeboys, they couldn't talk to me, and I start to dump what's going on in my life. For some reason, I felt the connection in just natural human chemistry.
In my opinion, Fabia has been manipulating Diego for a year now. I think he's preying on Diego's fears and insecurities, in particular, his fears of brain damage and his life after fighting. I say this because when I watched all of their interviews together, I noticed certain patterns. Fabia always starts his dialogue by talking about the injuries fighters sustain and how damaging Diego's fighting style was.
Yeah, we could definitely talk about bullying, but everybody thinks I'm crying.
Yeah,
so we won't go there with it, because clearly nobody wants to talk about the sensitive subjects of this sport, right? Like the injuries, like the careers and the life after fighting, right? Let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about, we want to see Diego look like Diego after a fight. And that guy, if you pull up any of those pictures, that guy looks pretty bad, whether he wins or loses.
Usually shortly after this, he would then present himself as the one who has changed Diego's fighting style to help him avoid taking that damage. Oftentimes, he also includes a comment about Diego having a life after fighting. Other times, he brings up Diego's daughter or his parents, and again presents himself as the only trainer who will accommodate Diego's needs.
You see now what's really going on, my friend. And on top of it, why is the community going to bully me, but yet nobody's offered to help Diego? I don't see 10 physical therapists to replace me. I don't see a nutritionist company coming. I don't see any trainers. I don't see, like, yeah, you can say, oh, my doors are open. You can come fly your ass to my gym and leave your kid. But I'm here customizing and tailoring it to fit into his life so he still has a life.
There are times when Fabia tips his hand too much, though. He criticizes the sport as a whole for profiting from the suffering of fighters and not providing them with a safety net when their careers are over. It's a valid criticism coming from anyone else. The problem is that if Fabia really cared about Diego's quality of life, he wouldn't just be changing his fighting style. He would be trying to get Diego to retire. Failing that, he would have told Diego to move to a real camp like ATT, and leave the UFC for another organization like Bellator, a place where he can fight other guys from his era of MMA and cash a few checks while he still has name value and a little gas left in the tank. I don't know exactly why Fabia is manipulating Diego. It could be money. It could just be viral marketing for the school of self-awareness. But anyone who understands MMA knows that it's not in Diego's best interest to keep fighting in the UFC. Unfortunately, I'm afraid this situation gets even more disturbing. I have reason to believe that Fabia has been coaching Diego to deliver the message that he is not being taken advantage of. After watching all of the Diego and Fabia interviews, I've noticed them both making two very specific comments. The first is that Joshua Fabia will say something akin to, "I didn't ask to do this," or "I didn't ask to step into this sport."
And considering I never asked Diego for a contract, I never asked him to be his manager, I never asked to do any of this. I never asked to be in the MMA world.
The second statement comes from Diego, who always makes sure people know that it was his decision to train with Fabia.
I'll first start the story by saying a little something. Because there's a lot of people out there that for some reason think that Josh has bamboozled me, brainwashed me, and convinced me to give him all my money. And this is none of the case. He's never asked for a contract. He never asked to be my manager. I asked him to be my manager. It should not concern people because, first of all, it is my career, my life and health that is on the line, and therefore it is my decision to go in there with whoever I want.
This is not the issue. I know. I have trained with more of the best in the world than anyone else. Like, is not anybody taking that into account? Like, I'm the guy. Like, whether it's my 2 years I did in Cali, whether it's all my time in Las Vegas, whether it's all the time at the greatest JacksonWink room where guys come in and go out.
And here's where it gets interesting. That statement is almost verbatim the same as the statement Diego made ahead of UFC 239, when nobody was even questioning Fabia or Sanchez.
And the guy is a real freaking Jedi. I would not be bullshitting. If you think I trained with all the greats, all right? I trained with a lot of greats. Don't forget that I went to San Diego and I lived in San Diego for a while. I trained with the Cali scene. You know, I rolled with the best of the best. I had Salo and Sanji and Jacare. I've rolled with the best of them.
You don't just say something almost exactly the same way on 2 different occasions, 9 months apart, unless you've rehearsed it. I believe Joshua Fabia was in Diego's ear long before the Chiesa fight, planting seeds of doubt and convincing Diego that he needed to preemptively let people know that he wasn't being scammed or conned, that it was all his decision. And I'm sure Diego believes that. He's being manipulated. Somebody came into Diego's life, someone that Diego admits he vented all of his emotions and problems to. Then, that person isolated Diego from his support group, and started to prey on Diego's greatest fear, which is CTE. And then that person positioned himself as the only one who could help Diego. If some of Diego's social media posts are to be believed, it sounds like Fabia has even convinced Diego that he's cured him of CTE the same way he claimed to have healed Diego's facial scars. From what I've seen, I think Diego's fear of CTE is the means by which Fabia maintains control over him. Which is why if you're somebody who is actually worried about Diego, the last thing you want to do is mention CTE. In all likelihood, Fabia has been whispering in his ear from the start, telling Diego that people would say he has CTE to drive a wedge between them. CTE was not the reason Fabia was able to manipulate him. The truth is, Diego has always been kind of gullible. That's why I talk so much about his career. So you could see the history. The first time he left Jackson's, the custody battle, the friend who embezzled $170,000 from him, the emotional struggles he has been through, his desire to believe in alternative mystical shit. Which is why I want to end this video a little differently than I normally do. I want to speak directly to Diego, in the off chance that he'll see it, or somebody will send it to him. Diego, I just want you to think about how many times Joshua has disrespected you, a UFC legend, and then said he was just humbling you. How many times has he mentioned CTE, or used your fears against you? How many times has he referred to the two of you as us, or made you feel like the world was against you? And if you're worried about injuries or brain damage, don't lie to yourself. Don't let some guru convince you that he's cured you, or that he's going to completely change your style so you can avoid damage. He's going to get you hurt worse than you would otherwise. Obviously, I can't tell you to retire, because I can't put myself in the position of somebody who has been fighting for 20 years. But there are other things you can do. You also have 20 years of experience with yoga, and who wouldn't want to learn yoga from a UFC Hall of Famer? Just remember that you have other options besides fighting. As I was coming to the end of this video, I was trying to think of some kind of final message to close everything out with. The truth is that there isn't one. We don't know what is going to happen with Diego next, and all we can do is watch the events unfold. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. It was an interesting experience making this video. I tried to do a few things I've never done before, like breaking down fights, and mixing that with a kind of career retrospective that transitioned into the more recent drama. It was kind of bittersweet. Diego is a legend, but some aspects of his story are heartbreaking, and I hope I conveyed that well enough. I'd also like to give a thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you, Tex Punchum, Trauma Hound, Derpatronus, Dan Thomas, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, CP, The Son of Man, Neem, Origami Fleshlight, Kevin Howard, and Medication Doesn't Work.